So I'd like to begin by wishing all of you good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whichever time of day it happens to be where you are, whenever you are listening. And as usual, we will begin today with the uh, prayers for refuge and bodhicitta. So please recite these prayers with faith and devotion, thinking about the meaning as you recite the words. O sangye chodan soge chonam la chancho bardo dane chapsum che dagi chenyen yi pesanam je drola penjer sanje drobar sho sangye chodan Soki chonam la chancho bardo dani chapsum che dagi chunyen yi pesanam ye dola penjer sanje robar sho sanje chodan sogi chonam la chancho parado dane chapsum chi dagi chenyen yi pesanam yi dola penjer sanje robar sho until enlightenment I go for refuge to the Buddha, Dharma, and the sublime Sangha. By the merit of my listening to the Dharma, may I reach Buddhahood to benefit beings. Until enlightenment I go for refuge to the Buddha, Dharma, and the sublime Sangha. By the merit of my listening to the Dharma, may I reach Buddhahood to benefit beings. Until enlightenment I go for refuge to the Buddha, Dharma, and the sublime Sangha. By the merit of my listening to the Dharma, may I reach Buddhahood to benefit beings. Semchen tamje dewa tan dewe judan dembra jurje donga dan donga ji judan rawa jurje donga mebe dewa tamba tam minralwa jurje nirin chadan nidan ralwa panyon chambola nebra jurje. May all sentient beings be happy and have the causes of happiness. May they be free of suffering and the causes of suffering. May they never be parted from the highest joy, free of suffering. May they dwell in the great equanimity, free of attachment or hatred for those near or far. And now, please think to yourselves that we must bring all of our mothers, all sentient beings, or as limitless as space, to the state of completely perfect Buddhahood. And in order to reach the state of Buddhahood, we need to meditate. And in order to meditate, we need to study and contemplate. We need to listen and contemplate. So think to yourselves that we are studying the Abhidharma now for this purpose. And please listen with this motivation of Bodhichitta. So today we are, excuse me, I check something. So today we will be speaking about the 7th chapter. We're speaking of the Dharma we are speaking about is the Treasury of Abhidharma by Vasubandhu, and it's explained by Wanchuk Dorje in his commentary Youthful Play. And of the 8 chapters, we are speaking about the penultimate chapter, the 7th, the Teachings on Wisdom. In this Teachings on Wisdom, teaching about has 4 main topics: the teachings on the knowings. What are the 10 knowings? In other words, what types of wisdom, what types of knowledge or knowing do we have at different stages along the path? The explanation of the possession of the knowings, how the knowings are attained, and then the qualities of the knowings. So these are the sections that we are discussing here today. We are speaking about the first of these, identifying the knowings, and this has 3 topics. The first is the distinctions between the forbearances, knowings, and views. The second is identifying the 10 knowings, and the third is examining distinctions among the knowings. So yesterday we spoke about the first of these, the distinctions between the forbearances, knowings, and views. And so today we've come to the second, which is the identifying the 10 knowings. And this begins on the bottom of page 498 of the book. Now, but first, before we do that, we have to remember, I think it's a good idea to just remind ourselves what we're talking about when we're saying the knowings. Because we do have these terms that came up in this in the previous chapter. We had forbearances, we had knowings, we have right thought, we have views. And so what is kind of like all of these, it's like, to use a fashionable term, it's like they're all intersectional. There's overlap between all of them. So basically what we're talking about with a knowing, it means something that you are recognizing the truth. So you're seeing and recognizing the truth. A view has, in addition to that recognition, it also has like what do we say? It has kind of the intent of wanting to investigate and look at things. So that's like a view, to understand how things are. And a forbearance is different. It's a cognition, of course. When we say it's not a knowing, then a forbearance is still a cognition, but it's also got a little bit of doubt, because it's still concurrent with doubt. There's still doubt in your being at the time that you have the forbearances. There's still doubt about the things you are looking at the time that you have the forbearances. When the forbearances perish, as all cognitions do, and then the knowing arises, then there is no more doubt. But at the moment that you have the forbearance, it's like the wisdom first arising, and it then comes down. So that's the forbearances in general on the path of seeing. Now, there are also forbearances are mentioned on the path of joining, but it doesn't really explain exactly what they are. But of course, there's a stage of the path of joining called forbearance. I think that's a little bit different, though. In other words, the forbearance is, as you're getting stronger and stronger wisdom, you're able to withstand more and more of the truth. You're able to put up with it. So those are the forbearances. So we're primarily talking. So generally, when we use the word forbearances, then we're talking about we can either be talking about the transcendent forbearance of patience. We can it's the same word in Sanskrit and Tibetan. There is the forbearance that is the stage of the path of the third stage of the path of joining, the third of the 4 precursors to clear realization, and there are the 8 forbearances among the 16 moments of clear realization. So those are the kind of 3 ways the word are used in general in the sutra texts. Of course, there are other usages of the word. So what do we say? I mean, it can be used in patience or forbearance. Has a lot of other uses too, but generally that's what we're speaking about. So now with so those are what we're speaking about. Now with the knowings, they're traditionally divided into 10 different knowings. And so we have to kind of figure out what they are. And it's actually not like 10 exclusive, separate types of knowing. There's a lot of overlap. It's kind of like 10 different categories of knowings. Actually, for thinking about knowing, there's an infinite number of things that can be known. And because there's an infinite number of things that can be known, then there is, if you really break it out very finely, there's an infinite number of knowings. even when you're knowing the same thing, or what you think is the same thing, each moment you're knowing it, it's a different knowing. It's a different moment of cognition. So in order to be, so this is kind of how the Abhidharma works. In order to be able to understand a particular, you can't talk about every single particulars because there are just too many. So you talk about them in categories. And so we break all the knowings down into different categories, either 2 or 3 or 10. And so that's the part where we're starting this morning. So let me get that text up. Okay, so identifying the 10 knowings. The heading is at the bottom of page 498 of the book. Identifying the 10 knowings has 2 topics. There's the actual classification, and the second is teaching knowing others' minds in particular. Knowing others' minds is a very literal translation of the Sanskrit and Tibetan words. And it finally occurred to me 15 or 16 years after I started using this term that actually we have an English word for it, telepathy. It took me 15 or 16 years to remember that we have this word, but that's what we're talking about. We're talking about telepathy. Okay. So the actual classification, it says too, maybe it's just because it's an English word that is too associated with like the spiritualist movement of the 19th century. When you say telepathy, you think of people in darkened rooms with holding their palms above tables and things like that. But, you know, so that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about developing the ability to read other people's minds, literally to see other people's minds, to know other people's minds through meditation. So that's a little aside. The actual classification of the 10 knowings has 2 topics. There is an overview and an explanation. And once again, I have to resize my screen to hopefully get everything all on one. Oh, here we go. So the overview is here. The verse reads, the knowings are defiled and undefiled. The first is called the relative. The first is defiled knowing. There are 2 types of undefiled. 2 types of undefiled are only the subsequent and Dharma knowings. So what this is saying is that actually, in general, when we look at all the different types of knowings, we can say that there are 2 types, defiled and undefiled. This shouldn't be a surprise because the topic of the entire treatise is defiled and undefiled dharmas. That's at the very beginning, it says that's the topic. So with the knowings, we also have defiled knowing and undefiled knowing. So defiled knowing, that means basically the knowings of, well, that we have as ordinary people. And the undefiled knowings mean the knowings that you have as a noble being in meditation on the path in particular. So in the path, either on the path of seeing, meditation, or no more learning, the knowing that you have in meditation in particular. So defiled and undefiled knowings. So the first is called the relative. It's what we use. It's the knowing when you know relative things. I don't think this means that every time we have a relative cognition that it is necessarily knowing, because sometimes you're just completely confused. And I don't know that we can necessarily call confusion or doubt knowing, as for example, with the example, as when you talk about the forbearances, they're not knowing because they're doubt, right? But basically when you have that, a bit of prajna, and you're seeing things and knowing them. So it's either like knowing a thing, like seeing fabric and knowing it's fabric. Or if it's like a view, either the correct worldly view or the five afflicted views of personality view, extreme view, wrong view, and so forth. Those are all types of knowing. Then the relative, so that's the defiled, and then the undefiled has 2 types. So basically we're saying that all of the undefiled can be categorized as either subsequent knowing or Dharma knowing. So subsequent knowing is exactly what we were talking about in the last chapter. In the moments of clear realization, we talked about Dharma knowing and subsequent knowing. This is exactly the same thing. Dharma knowing is when you're focused on the desire realm. Subsequent knowing is when you're focused on the 2 upper realms. So I think the name, there's a reason why it's called the subsequent knowing on the path of when you're in the 16 moments of clear realization. And then because it's called by that term there, then I think it carries over also here. So those are kind of talking about it in 2 categories, defiled and undefiled, or 3 categories when you split the undefiled into 2, the subsequent and Dharma knowings. So now we have in the commentary, we have the list here. How many knowings contain them all? In other words, how far down can you condense? How can you, we've got the categories, you've got an infinite numbers of knowings. So how few categories can you bring them down into? Well, they're contained in 10. So the first is Dharma knowing, which we've just been over, subsequent knowing, relative knowing, we've just spoken about those three. Knowing others' minds, or telepathy. The knowing of the four truths, there's one for each of those, so that's suffering through path. And knowing extinction and non-arising, those are the two that we spoke about as in the last chapter as being what? Enlightenment. So knowing death, rebirth, individuals, samsara, and so forth are all contained within just these. In other words, when you think about any type of knowledge, any type of knowing that you have, it can be included in any of these. So those of us who have not yet achieved the path of seeing, we are basically stuck in the defiled knowings, right? We're stuck in relative knowing. But when we reach the noble path, which will happen someday, there's no need to lose heart just because we're not there now. Someday, then we will be able to gain gradually these other different types of knowings. So those are the 10. So you've got just to go back and look at the list again, I just want to reset again. We've got the first is Dharma knowing. Then we have subsequent knowing, relative knowing, knowing others' minds, knowing each of the four truths, so knowing suffering, knowing origin, knowing cessation, knowing path. And then the last two are knowing extinction and knowing non-arising. So we talk about these, we say knowing extinction and non-arising, kind of combining them, but they're actually two slightly separate. They're kind of thinking about the same thing in different ways. So those are 10 knowings. So as it says in the next paragraph of the commentary, in brief, there are the two knowings, which are defiled knowing and undefiled knowing. So basically everything all the knowings can be broken down in the two general categories. For all phenomena, we have these two general categories. And so the first can be perception of either general or self-characteristics. Now here, it should be specific characteristics instead of self-characteristics, but it's mostly perception of relative things, such as vases, blankets, men, women, and so forth. So it is labeled with the name of the majority of its objects and called the relative knowing. So here I want to speak about these terms of general characteristics and specific characteristics. We've got general and specific characteristics. These are two terms that if you've done any Dharma study, you might have come across these terms. And so you might be wondering exactly what do we mean when we say them. Now, part of the thing about these terms, specific characteristics and general characteristics, or another translation would be universals, universal characteristics. Part of the issue is that these terms are, like many terms, used differently in different levels of teaching. Often when we hear about these, we're talking, it's in study of the Madhyamaka or particularly in the study of validity, there's quite a bit of about that. And so it also comes up then in the study of of the types of mind and the types of evidence and so forth, the basic texts on logic. And it comes up in many other texts. We talk about universal or general characteristics and specific characteristics. So what do we mean by these two? Well, basically, first of all, a characteristic is something that kind of like says this is what it is. Like, for example, if you think about the characteristics of fire, the characteristics of fire are that it is hot, or heat and combustion. For fire, you have to have the two. Now, it might be only a little bit of those two, but it's heat and combustion. The characteristic of water is, and now we're talking about the element of water, not necessarily the water we drink, but it's that it's wet and liquid, that character, that and so forth. So things have their own characteristics. We can also talk about relative objects having characteristics. For example, a characteristic of humans that is often given is that like a human is able to think and know, or able to know, speak, know, and communicate. These are kind of the three characteristics of, and living in the human realm. So those are the three kind of characteristics of humans, or four characteristics of humans: speak, know, communicate, and know, communicate, and living in the human realm. So in a sense, a characteristic is a little bit like a definition in English, and we often actually use the word definition, and translators often use the word definition for the characteristics. But there's an important difference between a characteristic and a definition, because a definition is the word or phrase that you, in the English usage of the word definition is, it's the word or phrase that tells you what something is. Whereas the characteristic is instead the characteristics of the object itself as they appear to a thought. So you're having a conceptual condition, a thought that is perceiving heat, or that is not perceiving, that is apprehending heat and combustion, and says, that must be fire, right? So it's not the words or phrases, it's actually the way the thing appears, the way the thing is interpreted by the conceptual mind. So it's a little bit different than a definition. And so for that reason, I usually, in my own translations, I avoid the word definition because I think it's a little bit different. Although in practice, there, of course, are some characteristics of things that function quite a lot like definitions that we give in English. But the point is that we're not actually thinking about the words that tell you about it. We're thinking about the characteristics of the thing as they appear to thought. So that's what we mean by a characteristic in a general. It's like something that tells you what it is. So we talk about the specific characteristics and the general or universal characteristics. So the specific characteristics are actually kind of more consistently, that term is more consistently used in, or used more consistently across the different types of Buddhist scriptures. Specific characteristics generally refer to things that actually have that they kind of substantially exist, that they're functional, can do things, that they actually exist in some level. So for example, in this great exposition tradition, we would say like the atoms that make up all matter, they are specific characteristics. Particles, the basic particles. When you look at, or when you're looking at the general category of cognition, we'd say that there is mind and mental factors. Those are specific characteristics. They're specific things. And so they're like kind of singular. They're particular things. So they're like an instance of something, or a particular that occurs. So it's not like a definition. So when you're looking at, for example, you're looking at your computer screen, all of the different particles that you are seeing are the specific characteristics. So it's seeing things on a very granular level. These are the specific characteristics as spoken about in the Great Exposition tradition, where they're said to be basically what substantially exists. So looking at the truth of suffering and seeing that the basic constituents, the 5 aggregates, that's what we're talking about. Or when you talk about, or you can be looking at the non-compound phenomena, that you can see the basic constituents of everything that we then kind of put together and make into relative truth. So that's a specific characteristics. Now, when you study logic and so forth, sometimes in some traditions, and actually some very common traditions of Tibetan thought, and that they often talk about things like a jug or a pillar as being specific characteristics. This is in the tradition of Chapa Chukyi Senge, who was a 12th century Tibetan master, and he had particular reasons for doing that, for talking about the relative phenomena as having some sort of existence, as being specific characteristics. When you look at the actual works of Dharma, Kirti, and Dignaga, it's pretty clear that when they were talking about specific characteristics, they were also, in those texts, they were also talking about the fundamental particles. If you actually look at the text of the Semakundu, the Pramana Samuchaya, or Compendium of Validity by Dignaga, or the either the what is this, causal, the Commentary on Validity, or the Ascertainment of Validity by Dharmakirti. In both of those, it's really pretty clear that you're looking that the specific characteristics are the particles. Now here, for Dharmakirti and Dignaga, they don't really talk about the particles as having substantial real existence. It's a difference from the Great Exposition because they are Mahayana masters. So that's generally what was initially meant. Now, for various reasons, later the specific characteristics came to be described, or relative phenomena such as jugs and pillars and so forth were talked about as being having ultimate existence in according to the Sutra school. And so therefore they would also be specific characteristics. And this is, I think, because of various epistemological issues that we don't need to go into now, but this is a view that has become very common in the Gelug school and is also shared and taught often in other schools. So often you will see when you hear this term specific characteristics, it'll refer to kind of relative phenomena such as, or what we would call relative phenomena such as jugs or vases or so forth. But when you look at Dharmakirti and Dignaga, it's pretty clear that what it means is things that are actually functional, and what is actually functional are the particles or the moments of mind or cognition that can then act to produce something, in particular act to produce a cognition. And so they have a function, so things that form a function. Other larger things would be like called a collection universal. They're parts of many things put together. So they're kind of like a collection. So we'd call that in Tibetan a tsolchi, or in English we could translate this as a what do we say? As a collection universal. So that's a specific characteristic. So here in this context, if you see your specific characteristics, what we mean are the basic dharmas, the basic phenomena, okay? Then we have general characteristics. Now, this is the term that is often used by Dharma translators. Later, after I finished this translation and I started working a little bit with validity, this was kind of my side project that has not really gone too quickly at all, but I'm working a little bit with that. What do we say? I realized I had to start reading Western philosophy a little bit in order to figure it out. Actually, what we Dharma translators have been saying are general characteristics are what Western philosophers have been calling universals for centuries. So it's probably better to use the actual English word that people are going to know, well, that they should know. I mean, at this point, many Dharma people have been using the word general characteristics. So people have studied with a lot of Dharma, the scriptural traditions of Dharma will be familiar with the term general. For example, many of the translations by Jeffrey Hopkins use the term generals or generalities or so forth. Now, basically what we mean with the general characteristics is this is very different among the different schools. So the general or universal characteristics, when we're talking about it from the perspective of the Mahayana, in particular is taught in the teachings by Dignaga and Dharmakirti, what you're speaking about are the idea that there is some existent universal that then has instances, like some cow, universal cowness that then would inhabit a cow. Now, this is something that Dharmakirti and Dignaga refute. It's actually a position of some non-Buddhist schools. So they disagree that there is this sort of universal. The universals for them are what we call relative truth. They don't truly exist. So that's kind of like an idea. For example, if the specific characteristics are the particles, then the idea of something made up of the particles, such as a vase or a jug or a pillar, then that would be a collection universals, putting them all together and having a relative idea of them as a thing when in fact they're actually an aggregate of many of other little things. So that's one type, and then one type of universal. And so then there's the other type of universal is where you have some sort of universal cowness that gets instantiated in every cow or whatever. So that's another type of universal. But those are talking about it from the perspective of the Mahayana. And here in the Abhidharma, it's used with a different kind of meaning. So when we're talking about the general characteristics here, or the universal characteristics here, in particular, what we're talking about are the characteristics of things being, of the truth of suffering being impermanent, empty, selfless, and empty. Impermanent, suffering, empty, and selfless. You've got these four characteristics that apply to everything that is the truth of suffering. So that's why it's called a universal or general characteristics. So you can look at a pillar and you can say, well, it's empty, selfless, impermanent, probably so. Suffering, I don't know how it would be suffering. Well, if we were nobles, we would be able to, if we were noble beings, we'd be able to see. But so that's what it's saying, seeing everything like that. Then looking at the origin, our afflictions, our karmas, and seeing that they are causes, conditions, production, and what are the causes, conditions, production, and origin. So those four different characteristics. So seeing those general characteristics. In other words, they're characteristics that apply to many different objects. They're also called aspects later. But so it's thinking about things in these ways. So for example, when we're doing the meditation, such as on the path of joining, sometimes you are looking at things as they are, just seeing them as they are. So that would be like a relative knowing of a vase or so forth. This is where Wanchuk Dorje says mostly perception of relative things such as vases, blankets, men, women, and so forth. But it can also be, the relative knowing can also be thinking about general characteristics, which would be like in your meditation on the path of joining, before you've actually seen, but where you're thinking in general that things are empty, selfless, impermanent, suffering, or whatever. So that's what we mean by general characteristics and specific characteristics. So here, in the context of the Abhidharma, the specific characteristics means those basic, the fundamental building blocks of matter and cognition, and also all the undefiled phenomena, those basic, substantially existent dharmas. General characteristics here means the characteristics that are shared, that are shared among different phenomena. So that is kind of that digression. That sort of a digression, I mean, at first, the first time you hear things like this is always, of course, kind of confusing because you don't know the terms. You don't know what we're talking about. If you continue to read and study, then I think these terms will come back. You'll read them quite a bit. And I think this will help you understand them later as you talk about that. Someone coming from the Tibetan tradition, before they talked about, even got to speaking about the Abhidharma, I better, as I'm digressing again, I better pause my share. So someone coming from the Tibetan tradition, if you're going to study these texts in the Tibetan tradition, the first thing you're going to do when you're studying is you're going to go through, early on, you're going to go through what they call the collected topics, which are like a set of different topics that kind of condense the basic sort of teachings. And so that you get these ideas of universals and specifics and all these kind of early on in your training. And so when you later come to see them here, it's like, oh yeah, of course. And so for that reason, in treatises such as this one, they don't really explain what it is because they assume that you've already had that basic understanding. You've got that basic idea about it. You've already thought about, well, you have, universals, like a universal is a jug. Well, what are the instances of the universal? Well, you have like, this jug, that jug. What are they? So thinking about what is the relationship between universals and specifics, or universals and instances. So you've got a lot of background to come into this. But when you are coming at it from where most of you are, unless you've been to a Dharma center where they have taught that or looked for a course on that, it's difficult to get that background knowledge. At any rate, this is what we're talking about, general or universal characteristics and specific characteristics. So so that is what we're speaking about with the relative knowing. So this relative knowing, as it says, the first, I'll just go through the sentence again, the first Perception of can be a perception of either general or self characteristics or specific characteristics. This is an editing error in this translation. It should be either general or specific characteristics, but it is mostly perception of relative things such as vases, blankets, men, women, and so forth. So it is labeled with the name of the majority of its objects. Well, what are the majority of its objects? They are relative truth. A jug or a vase is relative truth. Blankets, men, women, and so forth are all relative truth. They're relative truth because ultimately they're made up of all the particles or the instance of mind or whatever. So they are relative truth. So knowing them is called relative knowing. So then the second type is the undefiled knowing. And so if we want to condense all the undefiled knowing into as far as we can, we'd say there are two types of undefiled as well. They are only the subsequent and Dharma knowing. So that's, since there is no undefiled knowing that is not comprised within these two, the word only is said. In other words, the Dharma knowing and the subsequent knowing, what's the difference between the two? Well, the Dharma knowing is focusing on the desire realm. Subsequent knowing is focusing on the two higher realms. And so there is no other, well, actually, this is difficult. And where do things that focus on those, like cessations and so forth that are not included in any of those three realms, well, where do they fit? Well, I think generally they come up when you start with the basis of looking at a thing, and then you can perceive the cessation. So you start out from focusing on a particular realm. And so that's where we get the subsequent and the Dharma knowings. So there is no undefiled knowing not comprised within these two, not contained within these two. So the word only is said. So all undefiled knowings are either Dharma knowing or subsequent knowing. Now, for an explanation of these, the verse here reads, all is the subject of the relative. The sphere of Dharma is suffering, etc., of the desire realm. The sphere of subsequent is suffering, etc., of the higher. So all is the object of the relative. In other words, you can think about anything, relative or ultimate. It can be anything relative or ultimate can be the object of the relative knowing. The object means what you're knowing, right? What is the known object? When you're talking about knowing, the Dharma and subsequent knowing, the sphere of Dharma knowing is suffering, etc. So suffering, etc. of the desire realm. So these would be the Dharma knowing knows the truths of suffering, origin, path, cessation and path and desire realm. So it knows there are 16 aspects or characteristics: suffering, impermanent, selfless, and empty, and so forth, the 16 aspects in the desire realm. The sphere of subsequent is suffering, etc., of the higher, the same 16 aspects, but in the higher two realms. So that's the distinction. That's what they're thinking about, or they're looking at, seeing. And in that respect, when we're talking about cessations, they, of course, would be included among the aspects of the truth of cessation. Through the distinctions of the truths, just these are four. These four are these are four. So let me see. Can I get all of this on the same? This whole verse on the same line? There we are. So through the distinctions of the truths, just these are four. So we've got these two are what they are. Dharma knowing and subsequent knowing. And if instead of dividing them by the realms, you just divide them by the four truths, then you have four knowings of each of the truths. You have knowing suffering, knowing origin, knowing cessation, knowing path. So knowing suffering would include the Dharma knowing of suffering and the subsequent knowing of suffering, or suffering of any of the three realms, and so forth for each of the four. So those are knowing the four truths. Then it says, these four are knowing of non-arising and extinction. So those same four, the knowings of the four truths, are also, when you are on the path of no more learning, once you've become an arhat, then they become the knowing of non-arising and extinction. And when those two first arise, that is non-arising and extinction, they are subsequent knowing of suffering and cause. They are the subsequent knowing of the cause of the truth of suffering and the truth of cause on the level of the peak of existence. And we'll go into that in the commentary. Foreknow another's mind. In other words, there are foreknowings from which telepathy can arise. That's actually, that last one is a bit of mistranslation. Telepathy is from fore, would actually be a better translation of that foreknow another's mind. Telepathy comes from fore. So, well then, you say, what are the objects of these knowings, you ask? Well, all dharmas, whether compound or non-compound, are the objects of the relative knowing. So we've been through that. I explained that already. The relative knowing can know any object, relative objects, or it can conceptually consider the ultimate objects. The sphere of Dharma knowing is the four truths of suffering, etc., in the desire realm. So you've got the four truths. Dharma knowing knows the four truths and the 16 aspects of the four truths in the desire realm. The sphere of subsequent knowing is the four truths of suffering, etc., including origin, cessation, and path of the higher realms. So sphere here means like the objects or the range of objects that it can know, the sphere. Sometimes this word is also translated as domain. It's like in Tibetan, the word is chiyu. So the sphere of subsequent knowledge of knowing is the four truths of suffering, etc., in the higher realms. So then through distinctions of the four truths, just these, that is dharmas and knowing subsequent, are the knowings of the four truths of origin, suffering, origin, cessation, and path. So you take your dharma and subsequent knowing, and instead of dividing them by realm, you divide them by the four truths, and you get the four knowings of the four truths. In essence, they're the same. So one knowing can be either a dharma knowing, or it can be a knowing of one of the truths, or actually it's both. It can be, you can think of it as either way. It's just different ways of thinking about these things and different way of categorizing them gives you different understandings. And so that's why they're the different names. It's not like they're trying to think of more categories just to make it harder to fill your mind. They're trying to think of different, how do we understand what we're thinking about? And so when you think about it in one level, when you have dharma knowing of suffering, for example, oh, you're knowing suffering in the desire realm. And when you talk about that same thing as knowing suffering, then you're emphasizing the fact that it is knowing the suffering more than you're emphasizing the realm. So the four knowings of suffering, origin, cessation, and path, because they focus on suffering and so forth. So that, they're going to focus on either the truth of suffering or the truth of origin or the truth of path and so forth. So these four, from suffering to path, when they are dharma and subsequent knowing that is not by nature view, so our knowing of non-arising and knowing extinction. So as we discussed yesterday, knowing non-arising and extinction are knowings, but they're not views. When you have the knowings of the four noble truths, when you have the knowings of the four truths on the path, they are view and they are knowing. When you get to be on the level of arhat, there's no more view, and so you just know. There's no need for a view because you know. And so that at that point, they are the knowings of the four noble truths can also be called knowing of non-arising and knowing extinction. So when these two first arise, they are the subsequent knowing of suffering and cause, that is origin, because without a doubt, they focus on the aspects of subsequent knowing of suffering and origin that are on the peak of existence. Okay. So what this is saying, at the moment that the moment you become an arhat is when you develop the Vajra-like, or is that the moment you become an arhat? That's the last moment of entering arhat. You have the Vajra-like samadhi. That Vajra-like samadhi has to be focusing on the peak of existence. Now, the next moment you have enlightenment. So what is that enlightenment? Well, it is knowing non-arising and knowing extinction. It's these two knowings. And at that moment, it has to be focusing on the truth of suffering or the truth of origin on the level of the peak of existence. So it absolutely must, without a doubt, it says they necessarily focus on the aspects of subsequent knowing of suffering and origin that are on the peak of existence, because you've just been freed from those levels. So now there's the question is, well, does this mean that these first moments of knowing non-arising and knowing extinction have to have exactly the same focuses as Vajra-like samadhi? And the answer is actually not necessarily so. So the question here says, well, does not Vajra-like samadhi have the same focus as those two? I mean, it's like right before. If it's the immediately preceding cognition, then doesn't it have to have the same focus? And it says, not necessarily. Vajra-like samadhi also has to focus on the Four Noble Truths on the level of peak of existence, because it's overcoming the obstacles to the afflictions of that level, right? So if the Vajra, but it can focus on any of the four, if of the four truths. So if the Vajra-like samadhi focuses on suffering or origin, then they have the same. But if it focuses on cessation or path, it does not have to have the same focus. Okay, so this is basically saying that Vajra-like samadhi and the first moments of knowing non-arising and extinction are both focusing on the peak of existence, but the Vajra-like samadhi can focus on any of the four truths, whereas the first moments of knowing non-arising and knowing extinction have to focus on either suffering or on origin. So that means if Vajra-like samadhi is focusing on suffering, then knowing the first moments of non-arising and knowing extinction are going to focus on suffering. If it's focusing on origin, they're going to focus on origin. If the Vajra-like samadhi is focusing on cessation or path, then the first moments of knowing non-arising and extinction are going to focus on either origin or suffering, either of the two. But it's going to definitely be one of those two. So now the example here is kind of given in kind of a funny way, but it says, for example, when struck by a poisoned arrow, the deadly poison spreads to all the parts of the body, but at the time of death, it collects in the area of the wound only and is not in the other parts. Maybe this is why when you kill your monkeys with a poisoned dart, you can still eat the flesh without poisoning yourself. I don't know. I don't know. How does it work? At any rate, what this means is that when you are on the path of origin, or when you are on just about to achieve arhatship, you're on the level, you're overcoming the afflictions of the peak of existence, and so you can kind of go all over them. But then at the last moment, it all gets to the part where there's the real wound. Where is the wound? The wound is suffering. The wound is origin. Path and cessation are not wounds, they're undefiled, right? So you want to, so that moment you're looking at the place where there's the wound, where there's the poison, and then the poison is gone. You see that suffering and origin is gone. So that's why you're focusing on those. So this is not so clearly explained in Wanchuk Dorje's commentary. It's a little bit clearer in the in Yashomitra's commentary. Because up to the point of the Vajra-like samadhi, you can be, I mean, you aren't necessarily on the level of formless, though you're focusing on formless. You can be really thinking about, you could really be focusing on any of the realms and then get closer up to the level of the peak of existence, and then, you know, any of the four truths on the peak of existence. And then when you have the knowing non-arising and knowing extinction, you're going to be focusing on the area where you're wounded, the origin or suffering. Okay, so four knowings, that is Dharma, subsequent path, and relative knowing, can know another's mind. Now here, this is mistaken. It really should say that telepathy can arise from four knowings. Telepathy can arise from Dharma knowing, from subsequent knowing, from the path knowing, and from relative knowing, because it is by nature those knowings. So this sentence is basically completely wrong. I'm sorry about that. This is a good thing about this is one of the reasons why I'm teaching this, is so I can find all the mistakes in my translation. And when I find the mistakes, I'm delighted. If you find any mistakes, please let me know. The more mistakes I can find, the better it is. The better the next edition will be, whenever I get time to do it. Okay, to speak similar of the other knowings. So here it says Dharma and subsequent are known by 7 each. I should say actually Dharma and subsequent arise from 7 knowings each. The relative comes from 2, and the 3 truths come from 4 each. Knowing path is from 5, and extinction and arising are each arise from 6. So extinction and arising, for example, can arise from Dharma and subsequent. They can arise from the 4 noble, the knowing is the 4 noble truths. The knowing the path comes from 5, and so forth. So these are the way that they arise. Now, the next point is teaching knowing others' minds, or teaching telepathy in particular. There's 2 topics: the features of telepathy, or knowing others' minds, and the distinctions between no extinction and knowing non-arising. This has 2 points. The first, there's a teaching the features of telepathy, or knowing others' minds, and there are 2 points here. The first is a general teaching, kind of an overview. That is referring to telepathy, can't know higher levels, higher faculties, or higher individuals, nor can it know the destroyed or unborn, that is the past or the present. So when you're going to have telepathy, you can't know something that surpasses you. You know, you can't know something that's better. You can only know things that are on your kind of your, I'm using the word level here, on your basic level of capability, not a high level of meditation, I'm saying, but basically your basic level of capability or lower. So knowing others' minds should be recognized in this way, that knowing others' minds knows minds that are equal to it or inferior to it. It cannot know the superior mind. A superior mind is not the object of the inferior. We cannot know arhats' minds because we are their inferiors, right? So for that reason, the mind of a lower level cannot know the minds of higher levels that surpass it. Or the minds of dull faculties, such as interest through faith, or convinced through faith is another translation I used of this, cannot know higher faculties that surpass it. So for example, if you are on the level of convinced through faith, which is like the dull faculties on the path of meditation, you can't know the levels of someone who has the higher faculties, someone who's attained through seeing. But you can know people on the path of seeing, or people on the path of joining, or ordinary individuals. You can know their minds, telepathy. Or an inferior individual cannot know the minds of superior individuals, so that surpass them. So like someone who is like an ordinary individual cannot know a noble individual, and so forth. So because these all surpass what that mind can know. Now, the other thing is that when you have telepathy, you can only know a present mind because it is a subject that perceives the present mind only. It can only perceive a present cognition. It doesn't know the destroyed, which means the past, or the unborn, the future. So that's telepathy. Now, of course, telepathy is something that, what do we say? Well, a lot of people think that it can't possibly happen. But what do we say? It's described in all of these Buddhist texts. It's very, very common to speak about telepathy and also about other types of miracles. In fact, we'll get to speaking about the other types of the 6 clairvoyances, which include the ability to produce miracles and so forth later, remembering past lives and so forth. So these are all things that on a materialist level, you'd say, oh, that can't possibly be. But they're described in the sutras. And it's described that when you achieve the levels of dhyana, that then if you work at it, you can also achieve the clairvoyances. And it's described in the Mahayana Sutras as being very important to achieve these clairvoyances, and in particular the clairvoyance of, as it says in the lamp for the path of enlightenment, it's important to be able to have telepathy, because then you can know what you actually need to teach the people who you're teaching to. If you can kind of look in their minds and say, okay, they need this, you can actually know. So it's said to be very important on the Mahayana path as well. So I think I said this last year, but it's the way I feel about it. If we actually wanted to determine, can there be telepathy or not, it shouldn't be just saying absolutely there is telepathy. or absolutely there isn't telepathy. Instead, what we should do is do research. And so how do you do research? In the scientific method. Let's follow the scientific method and say, okay, we want to find out if there is telepathy. So let's get a bunch of graduate students, train them in the dhyanas, and see, can they develop the telepathy? If you do that, and it turns out that you train 1,000 graduate students and none of them managed to develop telepathy, either you picked 1,000 graduate students with dull faculties, or there's no telepathy. If you pick graduate students and who can then, send them off, give them the instructions, they learn how to be telepathic, and then, those clever psychologists, they come up with all sorts of tests. You can figure out if someone has telepathy, right? There's got to be some test you can figure it out. So actually use the scientific method. If you want to disprove that there's telepathy, you have to, first try and see, experiment and see, is it actually possible? And if you send 1,000 people to learn and they don't know, or you could find, the Theravada monks still practice the dhyanas, but they're probably not going to be willing to participate in an experiment like this, because actually it would be kind of contrary to you aren't supposed to show off qualities that you have. So that'd be the problem with using, Theravada monks or the Tibetan masters who sometimes seem to be clairvoyant. They always deny it. Everyone says, no, I don't have any qualities, because it's just really a bad thing to say that you do. But if we wanted to do a scientific experiment, that's what we'd have to do. So until you perform those experiments, you can't say no. You have to say there's doubt. Okay, that's my rant for today. Now, when we're knowing other people's minds, the question is, you've got those 16 moments of the clear realization that go by pretty quickly. So can you actually know those 16 moments of clear realization, or can you know when someone else is going through those moments of clear realization? So here it says, Dharma and subsequent don't know each other. What this means is that Dharma knowing, if you have Dharma knowing that is also telepathy, it cannot know the subsequent knowing in someone else's continuum. The reason why is because the Dharma is looking at the desire realm and the subsequent is looking at the higher realm. So they're on different levels. They can't know each other. So if you are being telepathic, you have to be on the same, you have to be on the same wavelength. You have to be on the same level as the people that you are, whose minds you are knowing. Listeners know 2 moments of seeing. Now, if you are like a listener, that's what Shravaka would mean, like someone on the path of meditation, or someone on the path of no more learning, an arhat, but not a Buddha or a Pratyeka Buddha, then you can know 2 of the moments of the path of seeing, the first 2 moments. You're looking at someone else going through it. You've got your meditation pupil and you see, they are going through the path of seeing, and then you can see that they're going through the first and second moments. You see those 2 moments in their mind through your telepathy. Pratyeka Buddhas or rhinos, 3. They can know 3 moments. And the Buddhas, without training, all. So the knowing of others' minds, that is Dharma mind or subsequent mind, that knows only those minds of its own class. So telepathy, if your telepathic mind is a Dharma knowing, then it's only going to know another person who is on the level of Dharma knowing. And a subsequent mind is only going to know those that are looking at the higher realms. Those 2 knowings of mind do not mutually know each other. You can't go back and forth, because they focus on the separate antidotes of the desire and the higher realms. They're looking at the separate antidotes. And so it's like, as it says here, it is like looking at the ground or looking at the sky. You can't look at both at the same time. Okay. There's no knowing of others' minds on the path of seeing. When you are in those 16 moments of clear realization, you are too busy going through those 16 moments of clear realization to have telepathy. And the reason is telepathy takes effort to produce. You have to go through the training to produce it. You have to kind of go through the preparatory steps. Most of us do. Buddhists don't, but learners and Pratyeka Buddhas do. And so when you're on those 16 moments of clear realization, there's just not time to have any telepathy, to go through those training and do that. Now, if they train those listeners who can know other minds and wish to know the path of seeing, that is, in someone else, in their meditation student, can know through knowing others' minds or telepathy the two moments of seeing, the forbearance of Dharma knowing of suffering and Dharma knowing. So then they know those two, right? And those are Dharma knowing, right? Then as far as focusing on subsequent knowing, because it is something that is accomplished through the effort of other training, subsequent knowing is not known. So what this is saying is that your student, you can see that your student is on the end of the path of getting to the end of the path of joining. It's in the stages of greater forbearance or subsequent lordly mind. You go through the effort and produce the telepathy of the Dharma knowing that knows Dharma knowing of suffering and the Dharma knowing, forbearance of Dharma forbearance of suffering and Dharma knowing of suffering, those first two moments. Then in the third moment, your student goes to subsequent knowing of suffering in the higher realms. So they're on a different level. But you, as just a regular old arhat, aren't able to switch to the higher levels without going through more stages of training. And by the time you've gone through those stages of training, they have finished the 16 moments of the path of seeing, or the 15 moments of the path of seeing. So you can't see anymore. It's just because it takes you too time. They're going so fast through the path of seeing that you're unable to see it. You aren't good enough yet. You're pretty good. You can see 2 moments. That's pretty good, but not the whole thing. Because their faculties are sharper, the rhino-like self-Buddhas or pratyeka Buddhas. Now, there are 3 different types of pratyeka Buddhas. There are the rhino-like who achieve awakening on their own, and there are also the congregating self-Buddhas. Here, even though it says rhino-like, I think that it probably also actually refers to the congregating self-Buddhas, but I'm not positive about that. But at any rate, these pratyeka Buddhas have at that point at completing 2 trainings and can know 3 moments. So they have higher faculties. They've completed 2 trainings. And so they can know the first 2 moments of Dharma forbearance of suffering and Dharma knowing, Dharma forbearance of suffering and Dharma knowing of suffering. So they know these 2. Now, then their student, or whoever it is going, they're pratyeka Buddha, so they don't really teach much. But they know that other being is going through the first 2 moments, and then that other being keeps going through the next moments of this. And at that time, they're able to train and get into subsequent knowing soon enough that they are able to then see the 8th moment, that is subsequent knowing of origin. So what happens is basically the student goes through the first and second moments where they're looking at desire, and so then the rhino-like self-Buddha is with them. Then the student goes on to subsequent knowing that, and the rhino knows goes into the training for the telepathy to see the subsequent, or the preparations to go see the subsequent knowing. And by the time they complete the training, the student has already gotten to the 8th moment of the path of clear, the 8th moment of clear realization, the subsequent knowing of origin. So that's why you say 2nd and 8th. Okay. Some say they can know the first 2 and the 15th moment. In other words, they're saying that it takes a little bit longer and they don't know it until the subsequent forbearance of the path, which is like the last moment of the path of seeing. In either case, they only know 3 moments and not more. Now, the Buddha is different because the Buddha is like a virtuoso meditator and can do anything. Buddhas can do anything with their minds, basically, that they want to. So the Buddhas, without any training, in other words, they don't have to put any effort. They can know all 15 moments of the path of seeing. So they're the only ones who can have telepathy that knows all 15 moments. Okay. Have I been digressing quite a bit today? I have. Well, during the time of, so what do we have? Yes, the distinction between knowing extinction and non-arising. So this is something we actually spoke about last week, so I'm going to go through this a little bit more quickly. Knowing extinction is recognizing the truths are fully known, etc. There is no more to know, etc. is non-arising mind, it said. So the etc. says, knowing that you've fully known, that you've fully abandoned, fully manifested, and fully meditated upon. There is no more to know, there is no more to abandon, no more to manifest, and no more to meditate on. Those are the two truths. So what is the distinction between knowing extinction and knowing non-arising, you ask? The Kashmiris, that is the Great Exposition terms, say Kashmiri Great Exposition, say that the two are similar during equipoise. In other words, when you're in meditation, they're the same. But the distinction is in terms of the recognition by post-meditation cognitions. You're sitting in meditation, and it's the same. When you get up, then you're thinking about what you meditated upon. And at that point, you can say, I have known everything, I've done everything, or there's no more for me to know. If you say, I've fully known everything, then that's the knowing extinction. If you say, there's no more for me to learn, then you're saying that's the knowing non-arising. So that's the difference in the thoughts afterwards. So the knowing extinction is the knowing that recognizes for each of the truths of suffering, and so forth. I have fully known suffering. I have fully abandoned the origin. I have fully manifested cessation and fully meditated on the path. So here it says, I have discarded the origin. I've made cessation manifest. I have meditated on the path. Saying, I have completely known suffering. There is no more to know, etc. That is, I have completely abandoned the origin. There is no more to abandon, and so forth. Up to, I have completely meditated on the path. There is no more to meditate on, is the non-arising mind, or knowing, it is said. So this is similar to the explanation that I gave in the 6th chapter. If you recall, in the 6th chapter, in Wanchuk Dorje's commentary, it talks about enlightenment is the knowing extinction and non-arising. It says that, but it doesn't explain what the difference between the two is. The reason it doesn't is because it explained here in the 7th chapter. That's why it didn't. So when I spoke about it in the 6th chapter, it was kind of filling it in. But here is where it's actually described here in the auto commentary and in Wanchuk Dorje's. So now here we have a question that kind of comes up. So unlike the Kashmiris, who assert that undefiled equipoise, that is meditation, can only have 16 aspects, the Aparantakas assert 28 undefiled aspects. So they say this difference is known by equipoise as well as post-meditation. In other words, the Kashmiri Great Exposition is saying that when you are meditating, you can only know the 4 aspects of each of the 4 truths. So that's a 16 aspects. So impermanent suffering and so forth up to the 4 of the path, those 16 aspects only. But the Aparantakas, now Aparantaka kind of means basically the other Great Exposition people other than the Kashmiris, say that there are actually also additional aspects for each of the truths. There are an additional 3 for each of the truths. And so because there are these different additional aspects, then they say that you can also have the difference between knowing extinction and non-arising in your meditative equipoise as well as in the post-meditation. So they say this difference is known by equipoise as well as by post-meditation. So those differences in the aspects will become clear tomorrow, hopefully, unless I digress too far. So now, examining the distinctions among the knowings. And so here we have 4 topics. Why are we distinguishing the 10 knowings? Well, the 4 topics are distinctions of the 10 knowings, distinctions of the antidotes, distinctions of aspects, and explaining other distinctions. So the distinctions of the 10 knowings says from nature, antidote, or aspects in the sphere, or training, or if it's work being done, or from development of the cause, there are 10. So we've got 10 different things that, we've got 7 different causes that divide the knowings into 10. So rather than going through the root here and then going through the commentary, I'm just going to go straight through the commentary. If there are 3 knowings, that is Dharma knowing, subsequent knowing, and relative, then why are they presented as 10? Why do we say 10? So relative knowing is presented from its nature and essence because it does not know the ultimate. So its nature is that it knows the relative truth. So it's called relative knowing. Therefore, it is from nature. So in the first line of the verse, it says from nature, right? That means relative is called that because of its nature being knowing the relative truth, not knowing the ultimate. Dharma and subsequent knowing are presented as the antidote because they're the antidotes for the desire and the higher realms. So those two are separated out differently because Dharma knowing is an antidote for the afflictions of the desire realm, and subsequent knowing is the antidote for the afflictions of higher realms. So those are two from the antidotes. Or they're different by their aspects. Now, aspects is something that I had hoped to get to today, but I've blabbed on about other things too long, so I won't get to them. But aspects are basically, they're these 16, primarily we're talking about the 16 aspects of the Four Truths. So when you're talking about suffering and origin, knowing suffering and origin are presented from their aspects because their focuses are not separate. In other words, when you are looking at the truth of origin, what you are looking at are the defiled five aggregates in seeing that they are empty, or impermanent, suffering, empty, and selfless. When you are looking at the truth of origin, you are looking at the defiled five aggregates and seeing that they are cause, condition, production, and origin. So you're seeing those different, so the aspects are different, but what you're looking at, the five defiled aggregates, are the same. Or knowing knowing cessation and path are presented as different because from the aspects and the focus, which means the sphere. So in the second line of the verse it says, or aspects and the sphere, because they have separate aspects and a separate sphere. In other words, knowing cessation has the four aspects of cessation, and it's also looking at the truth of cessation. Knowing path has the four aspects of the truth of the path, and it is also looking at the truth of the path. And these are different spheres. So they're differentiated by their sphere and by their aspects. So with the knowing the four truths, you've got four: truth, origin, suffering, and cessation. So knowing truth and origin, they know the same thing, but the knowings are differentiated by the aspects. In path, in cessation and path, they know separate things, and they are different, and they are also differentiated by their aspects. So, or knowing others' minds, that is telepathy, is presented from training, because you have to train from it. It is not as if it does not know other mental factors, of course, but because it arises from training in order to know others' minds, it is called knowing others' minds. In other words, what distinguishes is that you have to go through a particular training there's a process that you have to go to use your telepathy. So knowing extinction is presented from knowing its work being done, because at first it arises from the cause of its action being completed. What is the action? It's eliminating the afflictions of the peak of existence. And it's like arising from that. It's like, oh, I've done that. Not only the peak of existence, but all the other lower levels too. Knowing non-arising comes from the development of its cause, because it has all undefiled knowings as a cause. So it's like it comes out of all of them. Well, there's no more to do. So it has all of them as a cause. So in this way, they're determined to be the 10 different knowings. How far have I got? We'll go through just one more section this morning or today. The distinctions of the antidote. The Dharma knowings of cessation and path on meditation's path are antidotes for the three realms. The subsequent is not desires. So this is basically saying that the Dharma knowing can actually, on the path of meditation, can be an antidote for the afflictions of all the three realms. But subsequent knowing cannot be an antidote for the desire realm. So Dharma knowing, it says in the commentary, is explained as the desire realm's antidote, and subsequent knowing is explained as the higher realm's antidote. The distinction between them is this: the Dharma knowings of cessation and path on meditation's path, that is, when you are on the path of meditation and knowing and what you are knowing is either the truth of cessation or the truth of path, then they first achieve victory over desire. In other words, they first liberate you from desire. Because it is then possible that that very continuum of the path of familiarization, all the meditating cultivation that you do, will also achieve victory over the higher realms. They can also be antidotes for the three realms. In other words, you might be sitting there in your Dharma knowing, and you liberate yourself from desire, and then you're so excited, you keep meditating, and you liberate yourself from all of the three realms in that same meditation. The subsequent, however, cannot possibly be the desire realm's antidote, because subsequent knowing only arises after Dharma knowing. So when it arises, Dharma knowing has already achieved its victory. So in other words, when you're on the path of meditation, then you first have to eliminate the afflictions of the desire realm, and then you achieve the subsequent knowing of the higher realms. And so for that reason, it cannot act as an antidote for the realm of desire. Dharma knowing has already achieved victory. Thus, if it is logical for a subsequent knowing not to be explained as the antidote for desire, why is Dharma knowing not taught as the antidote for the higher? That is because it is impossible for all Dharma knowing on the path of seeing and knowing of suffering and origin on the path of meditation to act as the antidote for higher realms. So what we're saying is that when you have the Dharma knowing, if you have Dharma knowing of suffering and Dharma knowing of origin, this cannot act as the antidote for the higher realms. Only when you have the Dharma knowing of cessation or path can it act as the antidote for the higher realms. So you have to be focusing on the latter two truths. And because not all of Dharma knowing acts as the antidote, therefore Dharma knowing is not taught as an antidote, even though two parts of Dharma knowing, the knowing of cessation and path, can also act as antidotes for higher realms. So that is the distinctions of the antidotes. And distinctions of antidote means what they're antidotes for. So I think that this is a good stopping point for today. We're going to talk, I was planning to get a little bit further and to have a digression about what we mean when we say aspects, but I had so many other digressions and such lengthy digressions that if I digress too much longer, you will all be here, probably be overwhelmed. I better let you have a space to digest what you've heard today. So, we will, what do we say? We will recite the dedication and aspiration prayers now. So please think to yourselves that we must dedicate the merit of teaching and listening the Dharma today as representative of all the merit that we or any other sentient being has ever done or is doing or will ever do. And we should dedicate it in order that all the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas and great beings who uphold the teachings in all of the different traditions may live long, that their activity may flourish, and that they may reach all sentient beings anywhere in the three realms. We should dedicate it so that we ourselves can understand the Dharma well enough that we can truly serve to help them. Because if we don't really know what we're doing, we can't help the Buddhas and the Bodhisattvas. And we should also dedicate this so that all sentient beings may be swiftly freed of all sufferings forever. And that until such time that they may all be reborn in places where they can meet spiritual friends, and then meet those spiritual friends, believe them, have faith and diligence, and progress through the path quickly with no obstacles. May they experience no type of suffering in this lifetime or in any future lifetime, and particularly and swiftly come to the state of enlightenment. And so thinking in this way, please recite these dedication prayers. Osanam de tam che se pani tomne nye peranam pam che te Geganachi palong chupai si pe tsole roku no sho. Thank you very much.